Two. Hi, everyone. This is Bradley Carner back with you for another edition of Visions of Good Education. I am really, really excited for our guest for this episode. Alex Calderon, who is a teacher and the host and founder of the First Gen Teacher Lens podcast. And he's going to talk with us about a whole bunch of issues today. So, Alex, thanks so much for being with us.
Thanks for having me. Hi, everyone. And thanks for connecting. So I am a teacher in New York City. I've been teaching here for past 5 years. I grew up here for most of my life, a little bit between Long Island and New York City. But the first question I think is about my, educational background, right? So I grew up in, one could say in like impoverished kind of districts where unfortunately, one of the school districts where I grew up at was one of the first school districts to be taken over by New York State in 2002, because of gross kind of injustices among administration, where people were getting paid like 3 figures that were nurses. It was crazy. And then but I got through that, and then thanks to 2 programs. So here in New York City, it kind of started off this program during the Rockefeller era. It's called SEEK, Search for Education, Elevation, and Knowledge. Basically, those programs are for kind of underprivileged kids that's education's kind of got stopped due to like financial struggles, meaning like they couldn't get like equitable learning because either they had like some financial struggles which caused them to move around a lot, like myself. And then from that program, it kind of created a trickle-down effect. So I went to a state school in upstate New York, and they had a similar program called EOP, which is Educational Opportunity Program, which does the same as SEEK, just at a statewide level. And then from that, it expanded to another program called HEOP, which is for private and public universities not within the SUNY system. But definitely EOP for me was very helpful. They provided me with a guidance counselor that, was responsive to me on a one-on-one basis, like helped me get through not only like school stuff, but like personal stuff in terms of like being a first generation kid that's like struggling with like this copious amount of pressure that I think a lot of first gen kids have, where like, all right, you got to be the first one to graduate. You got to break that kind of change cycle. So I'm really thankful for EOP and those SEEK programs. And I think that's basically it. Now I teach, and I'm also in a grad program and run a podcast for the most part.
Yeah, let's dive into that a little bit. So I definitely want to talk to you about what you're doing in the classroom, but I mean, you got a full plate. You are teaching full time. You are a graduate student, and in all of this, and anybody that's done that before knows how busy that is. And all of that, you start a podcast. What was your inspiration for doing that?
So the reason I started my podcast, so I had, or I still have, I rarely use it, but I do have a personal Instagram account where I was following teachers. Like I follow this one, I call him the guru of like Teachergram and social media teachers. His name is CJ Reynolds. He hosts Real Rap Reynolds podcast, and like he has Sunday Night Teacher Talk Live. Definitely get his book if you haven't gotten to read it. It's published by David Burris Companies. That's teach like a pirate. It's called Teach Your Class Off. So I started from there, and then I started getting more suggestions of educators that had podcasts or had blogs that kind of talk about their experience from a teacher perspective. Now, that's all I was getting in terms of like on social media, where it was just like, all right, here's one perspective of teaching. And it's, when we think of teaching, like there's other teachers that have multiple perspectives, right? So I wasn't really seeing like anybody talk about like a first gen or kind of particularly like on a podcast, like a Latinx perspective, like, or melding the two together. So that's why I started it. And like it took off ever since. Like I never thought it would have been like as influential when I started less than a year ago. But yeah, it's been great. And I actually met through starting up this podcast, I connected with other Latinx educators who, you know, have the same, if not similar background as myself, which I would have never found if it wasn't for the podcast community, to be honest, because like they were like, hey, I saw your podcast, like it's talking about the same issues that I felt. Can I be a guest? And then that turned into like one of my first guest episodes on the podcast, where I talk about being a first generation Latinx student and kind of like the cultural tropes that like you have to like face, and then not only that, but like in your own mindset, like all right, you kind of create this whole idea of like there's this enormous amount of pressure when really like there is, but also like you gotta tell yourself like, I can manage this. So that's one of the reasons I created for the podcast for kids students that are feeling like that way right now, that like really found themselves drowning, especially with like the copious amounts of work that's going on, whether it be like especially virtually too, because like there's a lot of obstacles with that. But that's one of the reasons I started the podcast, and like I feel good about it. Like I definitely feel like I'm being a voice for underrepresented folks, so it's great.
I think that's really cool because, like we were talking before we started recording, you kind of expand your platform, right, of influence. Like you're on the front lines in the classroom, but then with the podcast, it sort of expands that platform for you in a really important way, I think, and creates and leaves a space for not just your voice, but the voices of others
Right.
that want to get out there. And I think that's really powerful. I love that you're doing that. I wanted to go just to dig a little bit deeper and sort of, all right, you're a year into the podcast and first gen teacher lens.
Mm-hmm.
And you talked about your aims. What's your creative direction, or what's your vision for the show? Where do you see it going? What do you want to do with it?
My vision for the show is to be, I guess, like continue to be a platform where we can find me, and then like if you have any issue where as a Latinx person or a first generation student, you'd be like, hey, like what are some guidelines that do I need to get through this problem, whatever problem it is, and then using that platform as kind of like a bit of a kind of like coping mechanism, because like I felt like I had no coping mechanism when I was like going through college, like where it was just me at sometimes besides my advisor. But you gotta think like your advisors have so many caseloads, right, of like kids, so it becomes an arduous task where you're like, I'm not sure about this, like where can I get immediate feedback? So my vision for the podcast is that, and then eventually probably I really want to, and then he's going to be a guest on my podcast, DB, David Burris. I really want to work with his publishing company and make a, a memoir of my life, and like use that as a platform. This is the first time I actually openly said it. So yeah, I think I have an interesting story in terms of like starting with like my mother's upbringing, and like her journey, and then my journey progressing as a first gen kid in the United States. So that's where I want to use the podcast. I hope that like it becomes more widely spread, as any podcast I think will, in terms of like just like a lot of people hearing it. But I checked one thing off my bucket list as being a podcast network on a podcast network, which is great. They have so many resources, and that's honestly what you want. Like I want it to be a resource that teachers can utilize to either get different perspectives if they're teaching maybe a predominantly Latinx community, right? Understand the nuances that go within the Latinx community, because it's a very I want to say kind of diverse community within the Latinx. You got Afro Latinos, you got white passing Latinos. You know, it's very kind of complicated and complex. So that's where I want my podcast to go in terms of that, in terms of just being a resource, being instantaneous feedback for students or kids that are looking to go into higher ed. Because oftentimes you find a lot of the communities that first generation kids are growing up in, and whether it be Latinx or, you know, any other culture, right? A lot of them are impoverished, right? And like you have the schools, like not I'm not gonna mention any names of school districts, but like you have school districts that are hiring folks that either are not certified or have limited certification, like where they're teaching outside their certification, which is not beneficial to anybody. So any kids that like are going through that, you know, what can they do? And that's what I want to be. I want to be another helpful resource to, especially those kids that like gone through what similar situations have gone through.
Yeah, that's huge. And unfortunately, it's sad that situation where you're getting untrained or like hastily trained teachers are happening predominantly, like disproportionately in impoverished areas, which is adds to the tragedy of what happens in schools that are highest need. So yeah, I really appreciate you doing that. So you know, in your podcast, you've had a lot of conversations, right? And you've covered a lot of topics. Um, and we'll, for everybody listening, make sure that you look at the bottom of the show notes, and we'll have all the links to the podcasts. But you've covered all these different topics within the classroom. What issue or issues do you feel are really most pressing right now in K-12? Now, you can answer that as a teacher and or as a podcaster who has sort of this more global view, if you will.
Um, I mean, obviously the elephant in the room right now is COVID.
Mm.
That's a huge issue, and like the social emotional health, wealth and like health of like, you know, well-being of like students. That's a very taxing issue. Like at my school in particular, I can't mention any student names due to confidentiality, obviously, but we've had cases where there are students where they like, you know, like I'm very depressed, like borderline suicidal, where it's just like that's an unfortunate thing because like what can you do if your building's like inhospitable and you can't do hybrid, and then you have teachers on the flip side that are quitting in astronomical amounts, and like teacher programs, their enrollment's going down, and I think that's the biggest issue right now in terms of like how do we you know, I think ironically about last year where people are praising teachers like, oh, I never knew you guys did so much work, and then now it's like, oh, you guys are lazy, like you guys don't want to go back to the buildings. Because oh no, we do want to go back to the building. Believe me, I want to go back in the building 100%. But due to this kind of international disease that no, it seems like it's not under control yet. I want to what's called hang back a little bit for the safety of the kids, because like that's my job. But that's the biggest issue right now, where teachers are feeling kind of under pressure and still not reaping those benefits, where it's just like, you know, people talk about the pay all the time, which is, it's true. The teacher salary hasn't gone up in over 20 years. And like for me living in New York City, like it's, yeah, high taxes, you know, all this stuff, it's crazy.
Yeah.
And like people expect you to compete, and like, you know, like, oh yeah, like some people I know have 3 or 4 degrees and like can't find a house. Like they're looking for houses, they can't, because like you don't make enough income. And I think hopefully that's a conversation that the government takes seriously, because I think like it's due time that we get our fair share of the pie. Like how do you have some teachers that have 3 or 4 degrees or multiple certifications and they're getting paid
They're
minimum
working
wage.
multiple jobs because their primary job isn't enough.
Yeah, and then that deters a lot of kids, a lot of good students from being teachers. And then you see that within the programs, like, nah, I'm not doing this. Like, it's low pay. I can't, like, it's like deal.
Right.
And then you have the battles where you're like, you know, teacher burnout. It's real. Like, I felt it this year. This is my 5th year. And like, that's like the quote unquote, like, year of like, either you leave or you don't
Yep.
or you stay. So, but like I think it's been burnout because like COVID has really taken a toll on people's mental health, right? And it's become not only conducive to teachers quitting or go on sabbatical or taking like leave, right? Or just be like, I can't do it this year, and that's happened across the board. And I remember when we got hit first, that was like a real struggle for teachers to prepare. Felt like we were just building an airplane and like we just learned how to fly. Like that's how exactly it felt. But that's one of the biggest issues that I see currently now is COVID, and then teachers quitting, and then teacher programs not filling the gap because of like the way that the work of a teacher's is is formatted, or in terms of like the viewpoint of like our society where it's not held to the highest standard. And then like
Right.
another issue that like I know we talked about this before, but like certain teacher programs right now were not prepared for uh I guess like student teaching. Like who is prepared for during this situation? But I really think this is an opportunity for a lot of schools to reform student teaching. Like at my school, like I think like oftentimes the professors would do things that are unrealistic to the workforce, right? For
Mhm.
example, scripting your lessons, right? Once you make the material, kind of the lesson's scripted already, so you don't really have to like say I will do this in like quote unquote and then like really script it out. Like I don't do that anymore. And I think the one way that we can like better prepare teachers for the actual workforce, or like kind of if we are in this kind of state where teachers or teacher candidates are leaving, right? Why not start junior year, right? Where kind of they have half classes in the morning, right? Or vice versa, they'll have classes in the evening, right? Like those late classes where they'll like go from like 6 to 8 or whatever, and have them TA in during the day, because that gives them a realistic aspect of like
Really
what right, yeah. And then you can do that to a partnership with a teacher. Like it'll be a year partnership, which they're a TA in the classroom. Then next year they'll be like the student teacher where they'll take the reins on like certain lessons. I think that's where we need to go in terms of like student teacher programs. Because what I found is like you're thrusted in kind of like this year you're thrusted into this space where you have no idea what you're doing, little to no experience, and you don't know if the person that is your mentor is really like vouching for you, right? So we have to make sure that like, because it's a very I want to say sensitive and precarious situation to be in. Like you have a young guy, girl, or person, right, in this position, right, that like hasn't been in the educational game for like at all, right? And you have to ensure that this veteran really, really, truly cares about like them benefiting through this experience. Because then why sign up and be a mentor? Like if you're not gonna be a mentor, like that's in the name of like when you sign up for student teaching to help out. So I think that's where we have to change one of the things, because I've heard horror stories this year being in grad classes from like kids that are student teaching right now
Mhm.
in the MAT program, I believe. And like it's just been crazy. I couldn't imagine student teaching right now. I would be stressed.
I can't either. And I teach student teachers. It just we say it regularly. Like they'll bring things up, and we'll say, well, let's work through this together because we have no experience with this. Like we didn't teach in a student teach in a pandemic when we were coming up. So you're right. It adds such a layer of complexity. But I really love the vision that you sort of laid out of what it might look like. I like the language you use. It's an opportunity, and I agree with you.
Right.
Opportunity. I think we should treat it as such. Well, you also detailed, in the first major issue that you pointed out, like the difficulty the teachers are facing, and I've spoken about, written about, and talked with people about exactly what you described, like the unbelievable narrative of teachers as heroes to teachers as lazy goats,
Yeah.
the metaphorical goat,
Yeah.
in a short period of time, right? And
Right.
then you layer on the living in a pandemic and trying to exist in a pandemic and then trying to teach in a pandemic. And then one of the biggest payouts that teachers get are those relationships with the kids and being with the kids. And that's been taken away.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's a lot. So I ask you, I mean, you're kind of at that, as you pointed out, that year 5, it is a critical year. You're absolutely 100% spot on with that. What gets you up in the morning? What makes you want to go and keep going in this thing?
So it's honestly like the kids. Sometimes I'm being transparent. Like with all the pressure of the state exams, I'm like, I don't want to wake up this morning because like it's sickening to do the amount of work and the copious amount of like data driven because it's skewed, right? Because we're all online this platform. We have students that the transparency of the test is not really transparent because like who's supervising the students. But what honestly keeps me going is the kids, honestly the kids, because you build these relationships where they become like your own kids, right? Like I don't have any kids, but like like it feels good to know that like you had an impact on these kids' lives, because some of the kids like have severe circumstances, and the fact that you can just brighten your day by like for me, I like make silly TikTok videos like TikTok, and then I post them on Google Classroom where for the kids like that they could see like it usually pertains to what we're reading, or it's just a silly like, or it's a problem but I mask it within a joke that like, hey, you don't have your camera on, or like kids would like cover their camera lens and then like you can't see me, or their background is like blurred. So stuff like that like really gets me going. Like the kids are informed about like what's going on, so that you do have conversations about like for example yesterday or not yesterday, but like I think it may be a couple weeks when the stimulus checks were coming, and then you had kids that like, let's see, what are you gonna do with your stimmy? And I'm like, what? So it's honestly those conversations that are going on. Like the kids are aware, as much as we like kind of value them on a numerical basis. Like socially, I think one of these kids are probably the best at like getting information, where it's like, because it's instantaneous. Like for me, I was on the cusp of technology growing up. Like we had like the baby got back computers, and then like the dial up and like AOL stuff like that. So we were on the cusp, but like these kids nowadays like have instantaneous access to information where you can create good fluid conversation. Like we talked about Black Lives Matter in conjunction with Martin Luther King and then Malcolm X. Like how has this become a movement through them? So it's good fluid conversations where it's informative not only to you as a teacher, because like honestly like I learn from the kids like sometimes like some of the trends that are going on. Did you guys hear about what happened in da 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 place? Like it's crazy, and like but it's honestly like at the end of the day it's like the kids. That's why like you can, anybody that tell you that's a teacher or working in the educational field to tell you like you don't get paid in in money. You get paid in the rapport with the kids, and that's more than wealth, right? I
Yeah.
mean, it should be, balanced, but like honestly, like that's why you joined the profession, is to have an impact for the kids. My coworker and I say that it's for the kids. Like, we do this for the kids. If I did it for a paycheck, like obviously, like you're not getting any benefits out of that. There's little to no benefits. But honestly, like, it's those moments where you see a kid like who's doubting himself, and like he was considered a one student according to the state, and then at the end taking the state exam, now he's a level 3.5, going into a 4. So, and then like him screaming, "Let's go, baby!" I still have that video. It's a kid I had like I think a year or two ago before COVID, and like just crippling self doubt. But like at the end of the year, super confident, one of the most popular kids in the school, and he was brand new to the school. So like you live for those moments where you want to see kids on quote unquote the come up, right? And like kids that like really are struggling, you want to see them outperform their own kind of preconceived notions of themselves. So that's what gets me up in the morning, where I can crack jokes with these kids. I can, tell them about my day. I can they know, they also crack jokes like online with each other. Like, it's so funny. Like, there there's this one student that like being online is super weird. That he fights with his brother, and then they like coined it they gave him the nickname John Cena, and then they'll like all play the music every time he joins the class. I think it's so funny.
Oh my gosh, kids are the best. And if you could bottle that feeling you were describing about them said and sell it, you would be a multimillionaire. There is
Oh
no
yeah, no doubt.
world like that feeling. It's awesome. That was such a great answer. Thanks. So last question. Fun, big idea question. So let's pretend I could wave a magic wand and you are officially in charge of K-12 education in the United States for a week. What would you do?
What did I do? Wait, only for a week? Jeez, it's not enough. It's not enough time. There are so many things that have changed.
I'll give you a year. It's my wand, right?
A year? I would change a year. If I had a year, um, definitely standardized testing. So, um, just a plug, I guess, for my podcast. I did talk about standardized testing in one of my episodes, and I feel like we're testing just to test this year, not really for any beneficial. Don't get me wrong, but we need standards, right? We need benchmarks to really see where students are progressing, and like kind of, you know, they're good. The way that we're communicating them and using them is not good. Like, that's not the way. So one thing I would change is definitely how the standards really view students and teachers. I would do it on a marginal growth basis, where if a student marginally grows, he's progressing, which is a good thing, right? And then not use that to be punitive on teachers, because every kid learns differently. You can't assess a kid just based on 1 or 2 days, right? You have a set like year. What are you doing with the materials in that year? So one of the things is, like, if I had a year or week, is really reevaluate standardized testing, because the new thing now is portfolios, right? So how did a child progress from K to, like, let's say 6th grade, right? So I would use portfolios. I know that's a new thing, or not a new thing, but like one thing that'd be like, hey, this is another way we can test progression, right? And you
And it's
can really,
authentic, right? It's
right,
authentic, not a
right.
limited measure.
And
Like,
then you can see like, all right, did the student try on this assignment? Like, I gave a project on X uh, literary element, and they did not try. Like, of course, you can see that, and then they could state their rationale, what happened. Obviously, you're probably going to have, like, some artifacts within that portfolio that are not their best work, but at least it's not a biased kind of assessment where it's, hey, how did you do on question two? Oh, you don't know that standard? You're dumb. Like, moving on. And that's honestly how some kids feel. Some kids who do really well in school feel absolutely crushed by this assessment when it comes down the pipeline at the end of the year. And then not only that, like, being in New York City, like, New York City is very segregated, and even Long Island, where it's just like, where the good schools are because of, taxes and like school funding, right?
Right.
But that standardized testing promotes or enhances the school to prison pipeline. Like that's crazy to me that like we still haven't figured it out or figured that out yet, where it's just like, if a kid bombs a state exam, also you can opt out these state exams. So like, because like what are they truly measuring? But one of the things that, like, if you do take the state exam, like, schools are going to look at this, especially in New York City, where you do have like your choice of high school. Like, high schools like look at the collective like grades and like, work, unless it's a like artistic school where they judge you on based like on an art portfolio, which is like different. But like a lot of schools look at the numerical scores, like, how are you going to bring my school's data up? And it's data driven, like, it's completely data driven, which it shouldn't be that way. Like, I think like this, we have a prime opportunity this year, like, to seek and kind of reevaluate what and how we do standardized testing. Don't get me wrong, like, I'm all for this. I like the English standards, the math standards, and the way they're teaching math in Common Core. That's that's funny to me, like, because I never learned math that way. I think it's completely backwards the way they're teaching kids math. But I'll reevaluate that, and then, because like, honestly, like, the standards were implemented for a reason, and they're not bad standards, right? They really assess how linguistically and in terms of like analyzing like the plot of the story, right? Which is what you want kids to understand. You want them to make text to self connections, film to like contrast connections, which I just did yesterday, reading The Outsiders.
Hmm.
Boom, great novel. And then we watched the film, which is played to a T, and then like the students were given this assignment, compare the film and the novel. But like, definitely standardized testing. I mean, there are other things that I would change that are, like, affect POCs. For example, like, I think the gross misconduct of criminalizing hair is an issue within, especially for, black girls, like, and black boys. That's an extreme issue right now. Like, you have kids that are going set home because a girl has box braids or color in their box braids. It's weird.
Yeah.
And then, like, not only that, for me, like, I felt like one last thing. There are multiple things that changed. Sorry, I know you said one
There's
thing,
a lot to change.
but also, like, I understand like why there's metal detectors in schools, like, given the grand scope of, like, things. But like, I honestly felt like a criminal going to school every day, like with like, having security guards, like, or National County Police check my bag. Like, I was like, what is this? Like I really felt like awful, and like, that's one thing that I really want to see change, or like, or have more mental health counselors, like, to kind of, like, be there for this, especially now with
Now,
virtual learning. You need, like, the amount of cases that we have at my school of like mental health issues is through the roof this year. Like, it's so sad, but that's one thing that I would like to see change. But hopefully, with in the near future. I mean, one can always hope, right? Those are the positive things that, like, you want to see. But for me, it's definitely like a crippling thing is standardized testing.
I'm with you. Fighting the fight alongside you, and and I know there are others are too. But like you said, especially this year of all years, this is not the year to test. It's almost bordering on criminal, and it's definitely unethical. So, Alex, that was a phenomenal conversation. Thank you so much. Everybody, please make sure you check out the First Gen Teacher Lens podcast. And again, check out the show notes. We'll have links to everything. Alex, thanks so much.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Uh-huh.